All right, hello. We are meeting today to talk about our several case studies where a failure has occurred relating to the environment. We're going to go through them in detail, and then we have a discussion about kind of how this ties into some of the things that we talked about in class. So the first case that we want to go over is the Love Canal. The Love Canal is one of the first major environmental disasters that happened in the US. It started way back in 1894. An entrepreneur attempted to build a canal in Niagara Falls, New York, to bring water to the city and hydroelectric power. Despite considerable backing, the project was unable to endure fluctuations in the economy and the invention by Nikola Tesla to transmit electricity over great distances by means of an alternating current. So because of those two things, the project was never completed, and the canal was sold to Hooker Chemicals and Plastic Corporation. This company lined the unfinished canal with clay and began dumping chemicals and waste into the then isolated site without really considering what else would be built there in the future. Landfills can be environmentally acceptable as a method of hazardous waste disposal, assuming they are properly maintained and managed and regulated, but Love Canal was not the case in this situation. In 1953, the chemical company had, of course, been dumping for many years, and the then owners and operators of the property decided that they were going to sell, and they covered the canal with just dirt, earth, and sold it to the city. In the late 50s, about 100 homes and a school were built at that site. And in the late 70s, so 20 years later or so no direct effects right away, in the late 70s, a record amount of rainfall had caused the clay lining to break as it seeped down and made the clay weaker. And these chemicals started to seep out into the community. So corroding waste drums could be seen breaking through people's ground and people's backyards. The air had a faint choking smell. The children were returned from playing with burns on their hands, their faces, because of how toxic the ground was. And controversy remains over whether Hooker or the Niagara Falls Board of Education, which is who chose the site, in spite of strict restrictions detailed in the land deed when they bought it. There's debate on who's responsible for that between the Board of Education and the company that sold it. Eventually, a state of emergency was declared by New York. Residents reported miscarriages, birth defects, cancers, other disorders, and continued to fight to keep the site vacant years after they were evacuated. Today, the ramifications of this environmental and engineering failure still impact building and policy today. So to relate that to what we've been talking about in class, especially some of the newer things this week, just things to keep in mind as we discuss, we have the national members of the World Federation of Engineering Organizations, WFEO, in 2001 agreed to this international code of ethics to hold paramount the safety, health, and welfare of the public, including people with activity limitations, and the protection of both the natural and built environments in accordance with the principles of sustainable development. Furthermore, they're to be aware of and make clients and employers aware of societal and environmental consequences of actions or projects and endeavors to interpret engineering issues to the public in an objective and truthful manner. So there's going to be some debate about this case, even though these new ethical codes were established long ago. So to open up the floor, the main view, or I guess the situation, was of ethical and professional responsibility. And I'd like to take it away with what you guys think the situation of ethical responsibility as it relates to just what the right thing was to do.
I think to start with, the city should have done more research before they even decided to build a school in her community on the land that they purchased, pretty much. Because if anything, they have the records of who owned the land beforehand. I think for a normal person, despite being an engineer, right away when you think about this place was owned by a chemical company beforehand, you think about what could have went here. Uh, so if just by the right thing to do, they should have questioned and done more research about what did the chemical company, do with the land before they bought it. If that makes any sense.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I totally
Yeah,
agree with that. But like also like starting off with like I think the Hooker Chemical Companies had like a huge fault here. Like clay is like already like an easy dissolvable thing, and you're already putting it next to Niagara Falls, which is like next to a huge source of water. So like even that, like you already start like already looking at a spot of like easy erosion to easily let chemicals like fuse out, and then like like they do sell it and like to the city, and then the city does build a school on top of it, even though they were aware of like the potentials of like the chemical company that was already on top of it. But like I think you got to go back first to like them just like easy like taking the easy way out to probably like save money, like building the clay like the surface to not allow chemicals to go, or like that's where they would storm. I think they're already like at fault there, like not even, they're just like I said taking the easy way out.
Yeah. And I kind of like to add on to that, like in terms of ethically responsible. And when you look at the environment, I don't think it's ever been good to just dump chemicals into the ground, no matter what the circumstance is. So, in terms of like environmental ethically responsibility for this, I think it definitely has to do with the company that decided to dump the chemicals. Now, what responsibility does the city have for buying this? Maybe not reviewing all the documents that went over this. I mean, they might have a professional responsibility, but ethically and environmentally, I don't think they have an environmental responsibility to that.
Go off what Joe said. Also, the professional dilemma, I think I can be seen as from like a point of view as the Board of Education deciding to build a school on the land site where they dump the chemicals. That just showed disregard for like environmental consequences and actions and health of this and the safety of the students and the staff. And yeah, for the ethical part, I think that could be traced back to just the chemical company in the beginning that began dumping the hazardous waste in the canal, and it just neglected the idea of ethical and environmental responsibilities. And yeah.
Yeah, I agree. I think that the chemical company like they could have seen in the future, and like they could have guessed that they would sell it, or that one day it would be like a place where people would live. So I feel like dumping like chemicals in this huge area like was not a great idea, and of course the clay was even less like wise.
Yeah, building on what Paul said, I think that the city really didn't were negligent when thinking about the social impacts that building a community would have on that ground. I mean, kids were burned, people had giant health detriments by those chemicals. So I think that in addition to the company, the city also was negligent in just the social and environmental impacts that it had building on top of that land.
Okay, one thing though. I think the reading on Wednesday, yesterday, there was a concept about many hands as far as like who to blame when something goes wrong. I do agree that the city did not have an ethical responsibility to like how can I say make sure the ground was properly function like properly working. Because I'm thinking if you want to buy a land, you probably would not go and like dig all this history about like what was here beforehand. Uh, but there's an aspect of like then who do we blame for what happened? Because at the core of it, like the city could have, although it was under responsibility, they could have spent more means into like knowing if it was safe for the community that would be like built there pretty much. Uh, or we could also trace it back to the company that was the chemical company as far as like you guys said, like clay is very fragile. Like why would you put it there next to a source of water? Or we could also trace it back to even the guy that purchased the land to how can I say, actually, I lost my train of thought.
No, to piggyback off that, I mean, it's almost like if you were to look at it from both sides, the company that sold it knew what they were doing. They knew what was in there. Did they know it was harmful? I mean, more information has come out in recent days about how harmful those substances are, how carcinogenic they are. But if you look at it at the time, maybe they thought it would just soak into the ground and be fine. And maybe the city thought, well, we'll just buy this land because it's so cheap. And then, it's not going to go up through the ground into people's homes, because for a while there, 20 years, I mean, it was contained, right? It was considered in a way safe. So I feel like maybe it's easier to blame when we look back from what happened, but at the time, I mean, maybe it's the person's fault who built the channel,
Yeah. I definitely agree with that. And before like we move on to a well-reasoned alternative, I kind of want to talk about how so there's two major players at play. We have the chemical company that actually dumped the chemicals, and the city who bought the land and built the buildings on this poorly poor health land. And so I just kind of want to talk about how who do we think like bears the most responsibility, or can we get like a ratio of responsibility between these two? I don't know. So I just want to know you guys' thoughts on that.
I believe that it's the engineers and the company, the people who work there in the company like are more responsible for the act, because of like if they were being honest like with each other, that won't even cause this problem. So some people like won't get like in trouble or something.
Yeah, I feel like it's the chemical company that made the most harm because like they put the professional responsibility before the ethical one. Like they sold it, even though like they could have like told them why would you build a city here? Like they could have done something. So yeah, for me it's like the chemical company who is to blame.
I think
I
there's an
feel like
aspect of
sorry, you can go.
okay. I think there's an aspect of one, if you have a chemical company, you have to be aware of what the waste is and how that behaves in the environment. Uh, as far as saying that the engineers were unaware that the waste was a dangerous chemical, that if anything puts more blame on them because they should have done the research. Because as engineers, like you have to be aware of everything that you do. You cannot just like produce and make something and expect, how can I say, not knowing if the waste or if the cost of making that thing will cost somebody's life in the long run. So the definitely more of the blame is to go on the chemical company and on the engineers for not having done enough research to either they did enough research and deliberately chose not to disclose that information, or not having done enough research not to know that those chemicals down the line will be dangerous to the environment. So
Yeah, I agree. Like saying like you need to do like more research as like an engineer, and then like what Joey was saying, like you shouldn't even like dump like chemicals like into the environment. Like that's already like a bad start. Like ethically speaking, like like if you don't like want it in like if you're like dumping it, then you already know what's bad. So then why you put it into the environment? Like like that could like cause like I mean like you see in the future they built a school there, and then ended up like I don't know. Then they had the problems with everything. So like I believe like it's like professionally standing, like I think you just need to do more in-depth research with it. So
You can definitely blame the manufacturer here, and that's a fair point. But I believe that the idea of government and why it was built is kind of lacking here. So we've built government to kind of sustain the people, right? To give them security and to make them sleep well at night. And situations like this, um, don't increase my hope, and don't increase my trust in that. Um, so it really shows that you have to watch out for yourself here. We can blame the manufacturer, but it really comes down to like who's taking care of who, right?
I also think a big question that would affect my answer on who's more responsible is whether or not it was disclosed that they were dumping chemicals. I think if they were hiding it in, there was virtually no way of knowing at that point when the city bought it that there were the chemicals in the ground. Then I think there'd be less blame on the city itself. But then on the flip side, if the city did know that and it was disclosed, then I think there'd be probably like a 60% or at least more responsibility on the city because they knew it and they still took the risk of building communities on those chemicals. So I just think to me it matters a lot whether or not that information was disclosed and that knowledge was there that the company was dumping chemicals and then covered it up.
Yeah, those systems were probably not in place back then. I'm not sure. But it really doesn't matter because they should have surveyors going there. I know in the current and like the now, there's surveyors going to like big plants, like even smaller plants, because they have to check it out. They have to like sign off on this and they put their name on them, like as engineers, right? And if something like this does happen, they lose their license and they lose, credibility for the rest of their lives. So it definitely should have been a system, but it is a learning, it's a learning point here, something to learn from.
Yeah, and I think there's a reason why, like now in codes of ethics, there's a big stipulation where engineers and specifically are, and people really, but are responsible to future generations. And in doing research more on ethics, I mean, there's the precautionary principle, which I didn't mention in the beginning, but in the absence of evidence that an intervention is harmful, the burden of proof falls on the proponents to show that it isn't, or which means, the burden of proof is on somebody to show that it wasn't their fault, right? Why are you arguing against it? So I think we've discussed really that the chemical company, I mean, they didn't hide it, but it wasn't proved by the city who bought it that nothing was going to happen. So I think it has means to fall on the city as well, because they really didn't do much to decide and make a good business choice and make a good choice knowing that they were going to have a lot of people living there into the future.
I kind of want to briefly touch back on the code of ethics. And one thing I want to bring up is the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, just because myself, I want to become a mechanical engineer. But so there you have 3 fundamental principles. And the first one is using their knowledge and skill for the enhancement of human welfare. I feel like the chemical company, even though they might not be mechanical engineers, they should still follow some sort of structure. And I'm sure they have their own code of ethics, but just relating this to the mechanical engineering code of ethics, I don't think they hit that at all, right? That does not enhance human welfare, dumping shit into the ground, stuff into the ground. And then fundamental principle number 2 is being honest and impartial. I don't think any of us know how honest they were being or truthful. So there's not much I can say on that, but yeah, there was not much I can say on that. And then number 3 is striving to increase the competence and prestige of the engineering profession. And I think they lack in this as well. This is not an example to follow. Like if a new company was being constructed and they were looking up to other companies that are older than them for solutions to other problems, they're going to follow in the footsteps of these companies and they're going to dump chemicals as well. And I don't think this is increasing the competence or prestige in the engineering profession.
Right, I agree with that. So to continue kind of our discussion about this topic, right, there's a couple more things to go over as far as impacts this has had. So we kind of talked about the ethical and professional responsibility of parties, but there's also 4 impacts that we should touch on. There's global impact, not just in the United States, global impact, the economic impact, environmental impact, which I think we know that is obvious, but I think we still touch on the points. And then the social impact, like how does it affect not only that community, but other communities as they discuss it. So any impacts that you guys want to talk about, let's go ahead and go over one of those all four global economic, environmental, and social impacts that this case had.
One, think about economically, for example, how much money went into making a whole area inhabitable in the first place, and the real estate that could have been in there if everyone had done their duty in a way. But because like they chose at least that, like we're presuming they chose the easiest way out of not disclosing the information, of like being lazy and not doing the research, that has cost people habitations, that has cost people money for the hospital that down the line, if their kids were sick and stuff like that. And you got to think like those people that were sick because of the company chemicals, like were they reimbursed money, like was the hospital's fees paid for, or was it out of the pocket for some mistake that an engineer did in the past instead? So
Yeah, not only the past costs, but if you think about like the current costs too, how it's affected the future. We need like more people now to produce things and to complete buildings, right? So this event has caused us to need like completely new departments and companies or third-party companies to sign off on what companies are doing. So that's definitely impacted the cost of product.
From a global standpoint, I just want to mention, I just looked up a couple things. We've been kind of looking at a bunch of negative things, but I mean, a couple good things could come from this, and I'm reading about it right now. Because of this event, it led to the passage of Comprehensive Environmental Response Compensation and Liability Act, and also raised a lot of awareness about environmental issues that were happening. So there's a global positive, I guess you could say. It did lead to some policy and regulation, some good policy and regulation, increased awareness about the environmental issues that were going on.
I guess we gotta ask like the concept of the suffering of a few bring the happiness of many. I think that's what is that called? A cancer? I forgot the what ethics that is. Do you guys know?
That's utilitarianism.
Utilitarianism. Yep.
Yes, yeah, pretty much. The misery of a few causing the happiness of many. Because technically, like not technically, like what happened was a community that lost really everything, but also what came good out of it was again having all these rules that protect future communities from doing the same mistakes. Then the question is, was it worth it? Like, were the engineers, did they do a good thing? You know, uh, I guess that's where it's like a good thing. No, but there is good thing that came out of this. Does that make it worth it? If it makes any sense.
Yeah, it probably wasn't worth it, but I think another way to look at it is the fact that this bad event already happened. So how can we make the most of it? So if somebody had the scenario where it's like, okay, you're gonna cause all this bad, but good's gonna come out of it. It wasn't really like that. It was kind of more like this bad thing already happened, so let's just make the most of it.
Yeah, and now that you mention it, I think Connor, to your point, I think that because I guess what something had to happen for us to know about it, right? Or people to know about it and make changes. So, I mean, this isn't a great thing at the time, but think about how many more things could have happened, especially with the growth of the Industrial Revolution. There's hundreds of these types of organizations or corporations that probably did business like that. And maybe they learned from that situation, because I'm sure the reputation of the Hooker Chemical Company and Plastics Corporation is shot, right? They're not going to do any more business. So it's going to help those companies to learn and then be able to mitigate those losses, even if, they're less likely to have done it without knowing that they would get hurt for it. Not that it was necessarily ethically good, but because something bad's happening to the company, the owners are losing money, they know that they need to clean up the way that they dump things. So to look at it positively with a little touch of selfishness for the corporation owners, I think that was a great point that you brought up, Connor. All right, as we continue through this, think about environmental impacts. You know, as we went over that case study, we talked about that, just literally acid in the soil, not great, right? Communities affected for years, decades. Social impacts, trying to think, you know, communities obviously learned a lot from that. Are there any other social impacts you guys want to touch on before we wrap up this topic?
I'm thinking what community or like what if there was any like racial group living in that particular place. Because it's like that would also like raise the question, how can I say? Did the government ignoring that, was that because of a particular like group of people that were living there? I'm thinking if these were more like wealthier people, you know, that had more influence, like would they have been quick to act once there was something wrong? Uh, if that makes any sense. I don't know if I had answered the questions or even like give an example. I don't know. I just came in mind, but
No, that makes sense. Yeah, absolutely. Because it was a smaller town. I didn't really get the details about the like the what's it called?
Yeah,
Basically,
Brian, I'm reading right now.
oh yeah,
I
perfect.
just pulled it up. It says a lot of people had to leave, be displaced from their homes due to the toxicity of the land. So I think Jonathan hit it.
Yeah, that's perfect. All right, let's go.
Um,
Oh, sorry.
Hold
Go
on,
ahead.
one more thing before we move on. I think we are also asked to present a well-reasoned like alternative to the solution. So if you guys have anything you want to talk about in terms of a alternative instead of dumping this stuff in the ground, go for it.
my theory is if you can get rid of it, don't make it. Simple as that. Like, why would you make a chemical that you know there is no way to get rid of? You know, but
I don't think that needs to be the case. We can make things that we can't get rid of, but we can recycle them. I mean, in this case, I don't know how you'd recycle this product, but if you could find a way to store it and reuse it in the future, that would be definitely a better route.
Yeah, I think that like the storage part here wasn't good, but I think that nowadays like we're better at storing like chemicals and even like nuclear things. So I think like if they build a box not out of clay, out of like something really strong, uh, I think we can store it like really well.
I think also one thing is if everyone knew their duty, as engineers, as the government, or as a businessman or anything, this would have never happened because at every level there would have been communication, and each person, like assuming that no one knew what's happening, each person would have known what was happening and made their own choice pretty much, and not using each other as mere means. I think it's one of the theory that talks about like how we ought to like do our will without treating others as an end instead of as mere means. Treating them as an end was just the company trying to make money, and not disclosing anything that was wrong with it. But it's like if at every level everyone thought about future generations and the duty they have ethically, this would have never happened. So
This was around the end of the Industrial Revolution, so like the priority of the health of citizens was definitely not in mind. But bringing attention to situations like this definitely helps for situations in the future, so it doesn't get recreated.
Awesome. Yeah, very well said, guys. Very well said. All right, our next case is we're going to move to the Flint, Michigan water crisis, which I'm sure that's very recent times. That's 2014. I'm sure you guys have heard of it. It's a little bit different than polluting the environment, the ground. Not really. Well, we'll get into it. So to summarize what was going on in Flint, Michigan, they decided to switch their water source from the Detroit Water and Sewage Department to the Flint River. This was due to financial distresses that the city of Flint was in. The water in Flint was much more corrosive than the water in the Detroit water system, and lead. The pipes were made of lead pipes. Piping system was older infrastructure, so the corrosive element of the water damaged the pipes, and then lead was in the water. The lead went to the residents, and there was complaints from these residents for I think it was years before something finally was done about it, right? But they began to complain about the color, the taste of the water, and it was soon learned that there was a genuine issue with the water, but the issue, like I said, is not immediately resolved. So there's some issues to go over there, but the issues were ignored by the state and local officials, and there ended up being 12 deaths because of this in the community. Soon after that, national attention was brought to the issue, and legal actions were taken, and infrastructure improvements were made to replace the lead pipes. But because of funding issues, once again, the process was slowed down. And you would think with the amount of poisoning going on, this process wouldn't be slowed down at all, it'd be expedited, but it was slowed down. So most of the ethical issues in this case study lie within wrongful government actions, which I know we just touched on. There were some engineering failures as well. There was a failure to properly control the corrosive water treatment process by adding the necessary chemicals, which was generally a standard practice, water treatment. That's very standard. There were also many aging pipe systems and plumbing fixtures that should have been repaired and updated by engineers. Of course, they weren't. Lastly, there was a lack of testing and monitoring of the water and the water quality, which could have been the duty of the local chemical engineers, or really once it goes from the river to the treatment plant out to the piping system, they would have seen these jumps, right? So getting into this case study, we have, of course, our ethical responsibility and professional responsibility. What do you guys think of what happened in Flint?
I believe that the government agencies and the official who is more like responsible to ensure the safety and well-being of the citizen. So the failure to provide a clean and safe drinking water and for the residents.
So this is a really good situation to bring back Jonathan's point about which groups of people are living where. So obviously this situation was relatively recent, so they didn't learn from the past, but also the majority of the people living in Flint are African American. So you could kind of connect the dots here and say that the government wasn't taking care of this city because of the population. And it is recent. We can't really say that that is why they're not taking care of the population, but that's just something to add, that over 60% of the population is not white, or 50% is African American as of 2014.
Yeah, I think that's true also because like they took a lot of time to like listen to the population and their complaints. So maybe that's why yeah.
I think at the core of it, every profession should have a code of ethics. Because the reading that we're reading on yesterday, it put heavy emphasis on the fact that medical professionals have rules that they have to follow pretty much. I think if every profession like had this and try not to discriminate between when to act up on this or when not to act up on this, that'll make a very big difference. But also, it's like even if that was there, like I'm pretty sure that is there right now. Like the government is not supposed to bring you like harm, pretty much. Them ignoring your issue, that is them bringing you harm. So with that being said, that means there is a code of ethics that they just did not follow. If that makes any sense. So
Yeah, I also think that from the start, if even if it was a funding issue, you'd think that the safety of your residents would be the priority. I mean, water is essential. Like everyone needs it every day. So you'd think they'd reallocate their funding to make that a priority and they wouldn't take the cheaper route and put the health of the community in jeopardy just so they can fund other things that aren't necessarily as essential as water.
I think also going back to this, like engineers in the first place are the ones to blame. Like again, there's the aspect of like do your research, you know. Like if they did that, they would have known that the water from the lake or river would have been a bad thing for the pipes instead. I think that's chemistry 101 right there. But again, like everybody wanted to take the easiest way out and they did not do the research. So
Yeah, it's almost like when they decided to make that switch. Actually, well, because the reasoning for them making the switch was money, financial. I don't know what it costs. I feel like it would cost more to switch, but they're changing their water supply because of money, and maybe because they didn't have any money, they didn't want to put forth the resources to research what this water was doing, which also makes me think, to your points to start this off, like probably a little discrimination is going on here, right? Like historically, that's been the case in the United States, and I feel like this is a prime example of not really spending the resources to help out a community that badly needs it.
There's another thing I was reading where like the engineers like didn't say that they like overlooked it, but the city was like kind of like pressured them to like kind of like overlook it and downplay it because of the cost that they were already in like a financial like situation where they couldn't like properly treat the water or like fix the pipes. So they were like, I don't know, the engineers probably had like a good idea, like, we need to fix this. This isn't right for the people. But I mean, the city does play like a bigger impact on them, like feeling that like, I don't know, like their professional integrity like wasn't good enough for like the role in that spot. So
I think something that we forgot to hit on the Love Canal was talking about the main viewpoints we've been talking about in this class. So I kind of want to quickly relate Flint, Michigan to, I'll start with utilitarianism. So the government, they gain from this by, saving a few bucks. Water is not expensive. Like it's not gold, it's not metal, it's not lumber, it's just water. It's everywhere. And there's the entire lake right by Flint, Michigan. It wouldn't take that much more money to, supply actual clean water. But because they wanted to save some money, we had 12 people die. And I think in terms of a utilitarianism perspective, this definitely does not hold true to that perspective and that viewpoint. 12 people dying just to save not even a lot of money. It doesn't even matter how much money they were to save. Like 12 lives, how do you put a number on that? I don't even think you can. So I think they definitely made a wrong decision in terms of that viewpoint.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, they definitely made a bad decision. And then to go along with like virtue ethics, they weren't acting with integrity by saving a little bit of money by switching. So it was just a whole like snowball effect of like not acting with integrity and honesty. And as virtue ethics states, like you have actions to build a behavior that becomes habit. And it just seems like that became habit as just ignoring the community. And I mean, it's still ongoing. I'm pretty sure. Like the issue was never fully resolved, and I feel like it just all stems from just not making the best choices ethically.
Yeah, and to relate it to Jonathan actually made the point a little earlier about Kantianism, like what sort of you treat it like the end, not the means to the end. And what kind of end do you want there? Like, are you going to poison the whole world with the water? Right. So it just goes against every type of ethical view I think we've discussed. And I must come back to the greed of a few people, to the bad part of virtue ethics.
Yeah, Brian, that first categorical imperative, this like wouldn't definitely wouldn't stand as like a universal law. Like this definitely couldn't go on everywhere. It's a good point.
All right. So to continue this discussion on Flint, there's still a couple things we want to go over. Of course, we have our impacts, right? Global impact, economic impact, environmental impact, social impact, and then we want to talk about our action item, our decision for who was the most at fault. We discussed the government here. They really seem to be the only player in this, but we can talk about that more. But let's go to those 4 impacts real quick, and then we can discuss our action item and what we think about that. So we have our global impact, economic, environmental, social. Pick one and run away with it.
To start with economic, I think this could also be placed on the last case study as well. But you got to think like in places like the Love Canal and in Flint, the property values of houses are going to decrease a bunch, and it's going to make it hard for people who maybe want to get out of there to sell their homes. And I feel like that's an economic impact that needs to be seen, I guess.
Not only that, but it's advertisement. Like this is like big advertisement for people that are selling filters, you know? Like who do you see without a filter nowadays? Like situations like Flint, and multiple others, I bet, kind of advocate for the use of filters. These the actual advertisements that like, they're telling you like they don't trust your water supply, you know? Like look at what your pipes look like. They're all dirty and stuff. But situations where it's actually affecting people is probably the biggest seller of these filters.
I think it's like a big social impact here because like the people are like they're trusting the city that they're getting clean water and then you end up having 12 people die and then there's other social effect that people are like trying to leave and the going back to the economical point like now you can't sell your house due to like having a problem with the water, so it really does affect a huge community right there.
It will also affect the local businesses, like the restaurant or the anything. So because the people like won't have the desire to go out, like to get something from the restaurant or to go out in any way.
You can also even look at the economic impact on the city. They tried to save money by switching, and then they're gonna end up spending way more money like trying to fix the problem, switching back. They're gonna have all these lawsuits that they have to pay out. So I even on the city side, they negatively like were affected by this also.
Yeah, and talking about this global impact, right? So it physically only impacted the people of Flint, Michigan, but I feel like everybody in the world kind of learned from this and realized that, or at least they should realize that it's not worth it to put the health of your citizens in the terms of so a little dollar, you know. I don't think that's worth it. I think everyone can take that across the globe as a view.
Yeah, I think environmental impact as the main issue was that lead was leaking from the inside of the pipe into the water, but not all piping systems. In fact, almost all of them nowadays, especially something that old infrastructure wise, they have cracks, they have leaks. So all that lead infiltrated water or lead infected water is now infiltrating into the ground. It could get to the groundwater table depending on how low that is, and that's going to travel to your lakes and wherever that seeps up into. So it's going to affect a lot of things, plant life. I don't know how lead affects them, but it's not just going to the residents of the houses, it's going to really the environment around. Similar to Love Canal, but Love Canal sounds like they were dealing with something a little bit more toxic than lead. All right, I want to discuss. I actually got another little excerpt for you guys related to the Flint, Michigan case here. So I know we haven't really talked about climate change, but in doing some research, right, climate change would only exacerbate the public health problem. According to a report from September of 2019 by Columbia University's Earth Institute, entitled How Climate Change Impacts Our Water, discussed how heavy rains would increase the surface runoff, and that moving water with more rain is going to strip nutrients from the soil, pick up pollutants, right? The lead that could have leaked out is picking that up. And these contaminants would adversely affect the nation's water supplies, right? So everybody, wherever that surface runoff of water is going to go into lakes, streams, and contaminate it before it even gets to be drinking water, and maybe they don't even do the choice to use that lake, river, stream for a source of water is going to be much more difficult economically to pick for a struggling city because of how polluted it already is. So climate change could have a big effect on the pollution levels of existing infrastructure or the existing choice for infrastructure to use for drinking water. So I guess, can you guys think of like any other impacts that climate change and having these pollutants might have, or ethically, where we should consider?
Another point, maybe like the polluted water can affect animals, and we eat the animals, so also it's another link. So what if like we eat something that drank this water and is sick, or so like it could lead to like I don't know, like medical issues.
You also think about not just animals, plants, take lots of water as well. This lead could be in plants as well. And also animals eat plants. So it all just bioaccumulates into whoever's at the top of the food chain, and just happens to be us. So yeah, we would definitely suffer a lot. And environmentally, the entire environment would suffer from our poor decisions of making these lead pipes.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'd like to, start to wrap up our discussion. We want to talk about, the action item, right, to indicate our choice of professional ethical situation. I was kind of brainstorming a little bit about the players in this. Like, there's the government, but the engineers, some of them don't work for the government, like the municipalities, like the wastewater or water treatment plants. They're not like working for the city. Sometimes they're their own separate entity. So they could be at fault too, right? Why did they choose? They receive funding from the city. So that's probably why they were pressured to look the other way. But there are a couple players in this. We have, the city itself, and then we also have maybe the independent engineering firms. What do you guys think is our action choice to responsibility here?
I feel like it's the government, like even if it's a separate company that builds those things, like it's for the city, so the government has to investigate and like see if everything is good and healthy, and yeah. So I think the government plays a big role, because like people in the city really trust probably the government. Uh, so yeah.
Brian, you mentioned there were third-party site surveyors, right?
Not to the specific to this case in my research, but I just mentioned that the engineering firms who would do the surveying of the water aren't always specifically for the government. So there's more than one entity there.
Okay, well, in this case, if there was a third-party site surveyor, I feel like the blame should definitely be placed on them because they commission out the water. They're saying like, "Hey, this is good, and here's my stamp. Like, we're done." You can blame the government, but the government just pays them to look at it, right? Especially if they're a separate company. Um, but looking forward in the future, the government could definitely hire their own site surveyors, like have them work for the government. I don't know how efficient that would be, but just one way to look at it, I guess.
I believe the government should be blamed on this because even though like there are a third party, I think that the government like should investigate who is gonna like work on the project because it's a critical and you cannot like let anybody like come and work on it.
Yeah, the
think more-
government still needs to ensure quality control to some degree, right? Even though they contracted out, if they did, to a third party, right? They still need to ensure that they did their work correctly and there's still quality work done. They can't just contract it out like, okay, all done. I'm gonna put the lives of my citizens in the hands of this company. No, they should still have a fail safe for this.
Uh, you're definitely right, Joey. And I agree with that. But you would think that risking your career wouldn't be worth such a small price here. So I think I understand the government's motive here of hiring a third party contractor and not having your own, because this is like a huge issue, you know. Um, so I definitely agree, but the government I don't think was very far off here. I don't think there's much they could have done, but they can definitely fix it in the future.
Yeah, you know what? Actually, I'm inclined to agree with you, Katek. I think why would a professional engineer, because they have the stamp, right? Like you mentioned, why would they stamp it without having done their due diligence for a one government contract? I think it's the engineers.
What do we think that the engineers should have done instead of designing these lead pipes? Or what do you think? How could we have avoided this with a different solution?
I think Brian said at the beginning, they could have, I mean, a lot of the responsibility was that there's poor testing of the water. They could have done better testing, and then some of the pipes were aging and the infrastructure was just not in good shape. So I think the engineers should have really looked into some repairs for that infrastructure.
You can add to the level of depth of their testing too. They could increase the depth of their testing. I'm not sure exactly what was going on here. Like it could have been oversight. It could have been a lack of knowledge. Considering it's 2014, I doubt that's the case. They probably just threw in a stamp and called it a day. But um, you can't have a third party surveyor for a third party surveyor, right? There's no point to that. So they're definitely accountable, but I'm not sure what else they could have done except um, regular surveying.
Yeah, I agree with all that. I enjoyed everything that you guys said. I think we got a lot out of this discussion. I think there's still cases to be made. Things that we hit on, though, were very important, and we definitely tied in a ton of stuff to this class. So to conclude, I think we were able to go over those two cases in depth and talk about the important things, the impacts, ethical situations, and I look forward to seeing how the future is going to take what they learned from these things. The most recent one that we've talked about was 2014. So hopefully we can continue to make strides in that area. And I appreciate you guys. Thanks for coming and joining today.
Thank you for setting this up, Brian.
Absolutely. Here we go.